I think I have tried to point out that the country has reached a kind of new era. The end of the Salmond era, the end of the Sturgeon era, has marked a sort of political pivot point for Scotland. But I think today it's worth having a look back at how we got here and actually what is meant to happen next. And when I say what is meant to happen next, I'm referring to Salmond's original long-range strategy for Scotland, which has taken us from being a nation which was afraid to be independent to now believing that we can be independent. Now, there is a reason why support for independence is so strong at the moment, and it's largely because we have been involved in a three-step process, which most of us, I think, have perhaps been mildly aware of, but not really having had it spelled out to us in as many words. Let's talk about devolution. Now, I mentioned devolution in the preamble today because I think this term is misunderstood a lot. The textbook meaning for the word devolution takes two forms, and it depends what it's referring to. Devolution, shall we say, in the natural world, in the animal kingdom, refers to a species or a genus of living creatures which reverts back to an earlier stage in its evolution. In other words, it reverts back to a wilder, more feral state where it was not as advanced as it had become. But in terms of politics, devolution has an entirely different meaning altogether. And in terms of devolution, is basically, in political terms, it is used to describe when a larger state or entity gives some of the, shall we say, more meaningful managerial, less meaningful managerial tasks to functionaries in the regions. And in this way, it feels as if we're being given some powers, but we're not being given any meaningful powers. We're being basically having some jobs given to us, which would normally have been done by the centralised state, and they're usually much less important. However, in terms of independence, these were seen as essential steps by the SNP under Mr. Salmond and, to some extent, by Nicola Sturgeon. However, let's go back to Mr. Salmond's plan. Now, the referendum was a chance that Mr. Salmond took to give us the opportunity to vote on independence, and many people at the time wondered about the wisdom of that, considering the low point of support that we had at the start back in 2011. However, by accepting devolution, Mr. Salmond set a goal, and that first goal was to get the term Scottish executive removed from common usage and have it substituted for the word Scottish government, because up until that point people had assumed, and rightly so, that the devolved Scottish Parliament, when it opened in 1999, was basically going to be a local talking shop, like a super council, a super local authority with much greater reach across the entire nation. But basically it was organising the day-to-day functioning of the Scottish economy, the Scottish civil society as well, and the rules and regulations which governed our everyday lives at shall we say, a more coal-face level. And in establishing, first of all, the Scottish Government rather than the Scottish Executive, it basically gave the people of Scotland a new view of themselves. The fact that they had a government which was governing the country. Now that was important because it changed us from being governed by an outside nation, England in this case, to governing ourselves. And so it was important, first of all, to get that term changed, and that happened without many of us even noticing it, although many of us may have thought about it in the back of our minds, saying that's an interesting shift, but nobody really remarked about it. The second stage, which was passed some years ago, was not only to change people's attitudes to being governed locally, but to make sure that that government was competent. And that was the next target for the SNP, to demonstrate competent governance at the local level. In other words, at our own national level. And I think under Mr. Salmon's tutelage, and in the early stages of Nicola Sturgeon's reign as the First Minister, that was demonstrated. Unfortunately, as we all know, this was derailed by a lot of, I think, spurious legislation about things which weren't important. LGBTQ rights, transgender rights, some green policies, and other things were distractions, really, which demonstrated that Scotland was being governed by people who wanted to give rights to everyone, which is fair enough. But it took the focus away from good governance into the minutiae of minority interests at a point where it wasn't appropriate. And so we passed the mark where good governance was achieved many years ago. And since then, we've been wallowing in this kind of limbo between self-governing, but without any actual powers to do anything outside of the nation, like defence or foreign affairs, or simply not taking orders from London. And because of that, we've now reached a nexus. And with the death of Alex Salmond, I think that has drawn a line under this interregnum, this period of inactivity and navel-gazing, which seems to have gone on for years in the latter stages of Nicola Sturgeon's administration. And with John Swinney being a continuity leader, that period of navel-gazing and introspection and microscopic micromanaging of the tiniest little pieces of legislation has really led us up a blind alley from which there is really no further progress possible. So we've reached what I would call a nexus, a turning point, where a decision has to be made to take the people of Scotland from the point of step 2 to the final point of step 3. And the last step is a huge one, and that requires the entire nation to take a leap of faith. And this is where yesterday I was saying that Alex Salmond's legacy was to show that if you have the courage to take that big step and to create the opportunity for it to happen, then you can change a nation's entire trajectory forever afterwards. And that's where we're at the moment. Devolution and the acceptance of the word Scottish Government have been achieved. We have a government. We have a government which we know is a government. We knew up until recently that it was capable of governing reasonably well and fairly competently and was doing a reasonable job. And then it started to diverge down all sorts of blind alleys and down rabbit holes. So before it goes any further down any of these rabbit holes, it is time for the political class in this country to start thinking about the third step, because the third step is the most important one, and this is where, as I said yesterday, decisions now need to be taken by major pro-independence political parties. I'm talking about all of them here. Do they want to take the nation on that final journey to full liberation or not? And if they do, why are they not talking to each other about it already? The SNP, under the, I think you have to say, the stewardship of John Swinney. John Swinney has proved himself to be an able devolutionist functionary of the UK government, and he's accepted that role and he's continuing it unremarkably. But that's not what's needed for this third step. People within the SNP who remember what the original plan was, and there are probably tens of thousands of them, not least of which are some who left the SNP to join and to build ALBA. All of these people are still there, and all of these people know what this plan was, and they need to start putting pressure from within the SNP, particularly at the moment, to actually engage with the other parties to complete Alex's legacy, because that is what we are needing to do now. Now that Mr. Salmond is gone, what is left is the goal unfinished. I'm not talking about doing this to honour the man, although it would honour the man. I'm talking about doing this because this is what we set out to do, all of us, when we took this journey. And that's the entire reason why Inde-Car is still here, and I'm still talking to you today about it. But I feel that this has gone largely unremarked in the press and in the sort of chattering classes on social media. This is what we now need to talk about, and this is where we need to apply the pressure on our political classes, and this is what we need to be talking about in hubs, branches, in meetings across the country, town hall meetings, independence groups, and online activists. We all need to start talking about taking the third and final step to full liberation. As you know, Salvo is doing the legal background work with the international arbiters to ensure that when we do have a vote on this, that we have the right to do so, and it's legally enshrined in international law that we can do it. All that is required then is for the politicians to take the final step and to stop bickering amongst themselves and indulging in personal vendettas and grudges, which seems to be all that's happening at the moment. So, as I said yesterday, this is the time when all of us need to put pressure on our politicians to realise that we've reached this point. This is the point where we have to decide. We either stay as a devolved state, as a lesser functionary of the United Kingdom, with all the troubles that go with that, and all the privatisation of our industries and the illegal annexation of our lands and industries by free ports and special economic zones, which are basically going to sell off all of our ability to control our own economy, or we take the final step. So that's where I'm trying to bring us to today, to get all of you out there who watch this program to begin talking about this on social media and in person with friends and with those who are yet to be convinced. Because at the moment, it seems to me as if we are backpedaling. We're coasting. We have no direction to go in. But I've always known there were 3 steps in this process, and I know that many of you out there know this as well. Acceptance that we have a government, acceptance now that we had a government which was competent, but which is now dithering and, as I say, diving down rabbit holes which are of no consequence at all to the larger constitutional future of the country. And so now it's time to refocus all of these minds and all these political operators on the task of combining our might to achieve the third step. And once that step is achieved, and that will mean everybody voting for pro-independence parties at the next general election in Holyrood, so that we have the legitimacy of a majority in our own parliament, which can then say, we're organising the referendum, you can't stop us, international law is on our side, and the result of that will mean that the Acts of Union will be repealed by the Scottish Parliament if the vote is won. That is how it's meant to be done, but we have to make sure that that's what happens. And when I say we, I don't mean the politicians. We can't leave it to them. It has to be us. It has to come from us. The pressure has to come from us. The marching season next year, as you might call it, when we campaign for this, needs to be bigger, louder, with far more people out on the streets. The pressure needs to become so great that all of the politicians can no longer ignore it. We also have to keep up the pressure from within our own parties. If you're a member of a party which is in favour of independence, such as the SNP or ALPA or the ISP or the Scottish Socialist Party or whomever, it's time now to put that pressure on. Anyway, that is it from Inde-Car today. I thought it might be useful to have a look at how we got here, and to remember the fact that Alex Salmond did have a long-term plan into the future, and yet he was cruelly denied the chance to see it through. So now it's up to us to make sure that we see it through. And remember, Alex Salmond was one man with a huge vision and the gift of being able to create opportunities and the courage to take those opportunities to make things change. Now we have to carry on that legacy ourselves, but not as individuals, but as a mass movement. And that's where our strength lies. That's it from Inde-Car today. Keep the faith, but remember, now is the time for step 3. See you soon. Bye for now.